everyone, really glad to see you all today. Before we begin, we would like to thank the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies, the Very Jewish Canadian Studies program at the University of Ottawa, the Huron University at Western, the micro program in Jewish Studies at the University of Montréal, and the FAICUM for their support. The lecture will be in English, approximately 30-40 minutes, and it will be followed by a bilingual Q&A and a discussion with you public. As small biographies, Professor Sarah Berger Richardson is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Law, Civil Law section of the University of Ottawa, where she teaches food law and policy, administrative law, and civil liability. She is a president and co-founder of the Canadian Association of Food Law and Policy, as well as a member of the Law Society of Ontario. Her research focuses on the regulation of the agri-food sector, with a particular emphasis on animal agriculture and meat processing. She holds a Doctor of Civil Law from McGill University and completed her Master's of Law, LLM, at Tel Aviv University, where she was a research fellow at the Manas Center in Food Safety and Security. In 2018-2019, she was a visiting teaching fellow at the Sholish School of Law at Dalhousie University. Previously, she served as a law clerk at the Supreme Court of Israel and the Canada Agricultural Review Tribunal. We have also Rabbi Boris Dolin. Rabbi Boris Dolin has been the rabbi of Congregation Dorshei Emet in Montreal since 2016. He is a graduate of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College and received an MA in Jewish education from the Jewish Theological Seminary. Previously, Boris was a rabbi of Beit Polska, the Union of Progressive Congregations in Warsaw, where he held a multi-congregational community working to help rebuild Jewish life in Poland. For 4 years, he worked as the associate rabbi and educator at the Temple Beth Israel in Eugene, Oregon, and previously was a nursing home chaplain and university Jewish student advisor in the Philadelphia area. Rabbi Boris was part of the first rabbinic cohort for 18 Doors, a support and outreach organization for interfaith couples, and was part of the clergy leadership incubator program through CLAL. As an activist, Rabbi Boris supports many causes, including environmental, food justice and animal rights issues, anti-racism and LGBTQ initiatives, and interfaith dialogue. He is on the rabbinic advisor panel of the Jewish animal advocacy groups Shamayim and Jewish Vig. He lives in Montreal with his wife Sarah and his children Elijah, Ezra, and Nehama. Guys, you're very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So thank you, first of all, Alexandra and Valentina, for the invitation. The topic that we're going to talk about today is something that both Rabbi Dolin and I are very passionate about, I think, in both our personal and professional lives. I won't speak more for him, but it's something that we've discussed on occasion in passing when at synagogue, and this has given us opportunity to go a little bit deeper and to share more between ourselves, and also now for us to share some of those thoughts with you. So we're really grateful for the opportunity. And thank you to everyone who has come. So I will share my slides. And our plan is to go kind of back and forth, and it will be a bit of a conversation dialogue. We'll take turns kind of sharing based on our own areas of expertise. And actually, I'll just put this in presentation mode. Okay, so now you should be able to see it, a nicer version. All right, so what we'd like to do with the time that we have today is to begin with kind of setting the stage. Why are we talking about animal welfare and religious freedom? And it's kind of based on some legislative changes that have been occurring in Europe. And so we want to talk a little bit about that and what's been happening in Europe and why this kind of topic is in the news. And then I will turn it over to Rabbi Dolin, who will explain kind of what is kosher meat and ask a harder question, which is, can kosher meat be ethical? And then we'll turn to, why is ritual slaughter, the term used for kosher or halal slaughter, why is ritual slaughter so contested? And then, time permitting, we'll turn to the question about what if this debate comes to Canada, or when it comes to Canada, what are the things that we hope will be part of the conversation, maybe to have a more productive dialogue when the time comes. So these are some headlines taken from the news over the past few years that kind of are talking about legislative changes in several countries across Europe: Denmark, Belgium, Slovenia, Finland, countries that have banned kosher and halal slaughter. And so what this means is that many countries around the world, Canada included, have a requirement in our food regulations that require that when an animal is slaughtered for meat, it has to be unconscious before it is killed. And so, in other words, the animal has to be stunned, rendered unconscious, and then killed. And the reason for this is to reduce as much as possible animal suffering before the animal is killed. And so can't eliminate suffering, but most of the regulations will call for eliminating avoidable suffering. And stunning is a method that's been used. Electrical stunning has existed since the 1920s. And it's something that can be used to render the animal unconscious before it is killed. And this is kind of the common or the required practice in Canada and the United States and many countries in Europe, but there's also always been an exception. And so many countries will provide an exception in their laws, in their regulations, that say that while the general practice is to stun the animal before it's killed, that there are exceptions to this and that the animal can be killed while conscious if it's for the slaughter of animals in accordance with kind of ritual religious practices. And so there's been this exception for religious slaughter, which basically kind of refers to kosher and halal slaughter. And so what happened in the last kind of 10 years, a number of countries in Europe modified their regulations to remove that exception. And so while the general rule is free stunning, the exception that existed for religious slaughter was removed, meaning that all slaughter activities had to align with the stunning requirement. And this raised questions about whether these bans were constitutional. And there were lots of kind of legal questions and legal disputes. And kind of most recently, kind of reforms in Belgium, in two regions of Belgium, the Walloon region and the Flemish region. They had both adopted decrees. And those decrees were referred up to the European Court of Justice to rule on whether they were constitutional or not. And this is basically kind of raising questions about, on the one hand, animal welfare protections, animal welfare laws, and on the other hand, religious freedom. And so the court was tasked with essentially balancing animal welfare and religious freedom. And in 2020, the European Court of Justice held that the two Belgian regions were allowed to have this regulation that removed any exceptions for kosher or religious slaughter. And so it's been described as kind of ruling in favor, or kind of holding that animal welfare is more important than religious freedom. And I just want to kind of clarify that the court is not saying that one right is more important than the other. They both exist, but kind of the legal question is, how do those get reconciled in this particular instance? And so just very quickly, I'll kind of show you, these are what the general European requirements are. This is not the Belgian rules, but this is the general rules in Europe. I have them in French here, and I'll just kind of say in English. This is the general requirement that animals have to be stunned before they're killed. That's provided in the Council regulation, the European Council regulation on the protection of animals at the time of killing, with an exception. So this is the kind of exception that exists normally, but that Belgium and Slovenia and Finland and Denmark have all removed from their own domestic regulations. And then on the other hand, we do have, provisions in the European Convention of Human Rights, Article 9, that protects freedom of religion, and similarly, the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union also provides for freedom of religion. And so the court had to balance the two, religious freedom and animal welfare. And essentially what the court did was they found that without saying that one right is more important than the other, they found that the decree in Belgium was proportional. So in constitutional law, we kind of try to see whether a restriction on a right is proportional or not. Does it kind of seek to limit a recognized right, but with an objective, for kind of a legitimate objective? And animal welfare was considered to be a legitimate objective. And it was seen to be a proportional restriction because the Belgian legislation doesn't actually ban, in its wording, kosher or halal slaughter, doesn't ban ritual slaughter, but it says that animals have to be submitted to reversible stunning before they are killed. And so reversible stunning is usually in the context of kind of an electric shock that is administered to the animal. It doesn't kill the animal. It doesn't render them unconscious forever. It's for a very short period of time. And the legislation essentially said that if you use reversible stunning so that the animal is unconscious at the time that its throat is slit, then it would be legal, but without actually banning ritual slaughter. Now, of course, and I'll stop there and turn it over to Rabbi Dolin, but the question then becomes, according to many people, reversible stunning isn't acceptable, and definitely not within the Jewish tradition. There's more debate within Islam. And so the legislation doesn't ban ritual slaughter, but it requires a practice that many say is inconsistent with kosher slaughter, and so de facto becomes a ban. But anyways, the court found that it was legal, and so kind of where we are right now is we have all of these countries in Europe that are restricting ritual slaughter. So I'll stop there and I'll turn it over to Rabbi Dolin.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So as Sarah had said, these issues have always been very important for me. But as a rabbi, I'm kind of caught in a tough place as someone who very much supports animal rights issues and environmental and human rights issues, but also is paying attention to growing anti-Semitism in the world and the different ways that this appears, in Canada, with relations with Israel. And unfortunately, when we speak about these changing regulations with kosher slaughter, it's sometimes as easy and sometimes to divide what is just flat out anti-Semitism and what is actually reaching towards more compassion for animals or more ethical slaughter. So just to put some of this in context, I thought I could give a brief introduction to kashrut in general, and more specifically a shechita, which is kosher slaughter. And I'll be sharing my screen too. So starting with the word kosher, which is often used in conversation as a way of saying that something is fit. You can say, many Jews say, oh, this building is kosher, this relationship is kosher. It's a way of saying that everything is, fits the standards. The reality, though, is kashrut, when it connected with kosher slaughter with meat, means that it follows the halacha, the regulations of how the animal is slaughtered and how the food is prepared. One of the important things to mention right at the beginning, we have two kinds of halachot, two kinds of laws, mitzvot in Judaism. There are mishpatim, which are laws that make sense, pretty easily. We have laws against murdering, from stealing. These, in our daily interactions, we know it's wrong to steal, it's wrong to murder. Love your neighbor. They're positive and negative mitzvot. But chukim are the other kind of laws, and these are not necessarily ones that make as much sense. There are laws about mixing fabrics. There are laws about family purity and going to the mikveh and how people should relate to each other. And even though, and I'll get into this later, there are definitely ethical reasons that have been introduced for why people keep kosher, why animals are slaughtered according to the laws of shechita. At its core, if you look at the tradition, kashrut is, we follow the rules of kashrut because essentially God told us so. These are rules that are based on faith and that are based not necessarily on science, biology, or ethics in the same way that we would look at it in other ways. And this is where things get challenging. So if you challenge kosher slaughter, saying this is about ethics, values, while that is true, at its core, it's about faith and identity, and that's where it gets into questions of anti-Semitism and challenging the Jewish community in general. So another just a brief point is that even though Judaism is filled with regulations and rules about compassion for animals and environmental issues, social justice, and human rights, again with kashrut, it needs to start with just pure faith. So let's look at a few of these texts, and this is just the basics, so it shouldn't take too long. Two main sources. The first one is from Leviticus, where we're told which animals we can eat. So it says in Leviticus 11, God spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, "Speak to the Israelite people thus, these are the creatures you can eat." And it says, what does an animal need to have? True hoofs, clefts through the hooves, they need to chew their cud. So what does this mean? For most Jews, this means cows, but you can officially eat goats. You cannot eat pigs. With birds, there are many birds you can't eat. You can't eat birds of prey, but again, for Jews, this mostly means chickens, ducks, maybe geese. And you can have some insects, including locusts and grasshoppers, but there are actually rules that these do not need to be slaughtered according to kosher rules. So some of the animals that are also kosher that are not as commonly eaten, we have here, of course, the cow. Deuteronomy says more specifically about the beginnings of the rules of shechita, which is kosher slaughter. So it says, in the place where Yud-He Vav-He, God has chosen to establish a divine name is too far from you. You may slaughter any of the cattle or the sheep that God gives to you, as I've instructed you. So what it says, these are the key ideas of shechita. But make sure you do not partake of the blood, for blood is the life. And notice, that's a value in there. Blood is life, but it's not necessarily social justice. It's not necessarily, at this point, a compassion for animals in the same way. You must not consume the life of the flesh. You must pour it out on the ground like water. And why? And this is where that idea of it being a chok. Why do this? Not because necessarily, even though we do care about about compassion for animals, human rights, pain, suffering, that is all very important. But what is the core idea? So that God will support you and that you will be doing what's right in the eyes of God. So shechita specifically is considered a very holy act. This is not just, it's ritual slaughter, but it's considered a way of honoring the animal, honoring our connection with God, and honoring the food that we eat. And there are many beautiful paintings and images of the past of showing, this is not meant to be something that makes us turn away, but is meant to be a mitzvah, a holy act. And who does this? A shochet. So this is someone who is specially trained to do this act of killing the animals, of slaughtering the animals. So they usually do an apprenticeship. They study Torah. They need to be religious Jews. And this is important. They're God-fearing. There's a beautiful story of the Baal Shem Tov, who founded the Hasidic movement, who said that that he started his life as a shochet, and he actually became this great rabbi. And there was another rabbi in town who used to go past this old shochet plate, the kosher slaughter, and would always shake his head. And the man who took over the job of shochet asked him, "Why are you shaking your head?" And he said, "The Baal Shem Tov didn't just care about the animals, but he wet the knife with his tears." So there was something so holy. It was painful. It was a loss of a life, but it had to be based on this deep connection with God and values. It wasn't just killing the animal, and it wasn't even just not causing suffering. This was about communion between God and people. And of course, today it's still a very important role for Jews to have. I'm going to skip through this because we don't have a lot of time. But we're told in the Torah, it doesn't say much about the act of shechita, but the Rambam and many other law codes give us specifics about how the animal slaughtered, through the neck, not cutting the spine, about the blood being drained. There's a special knife, a chalaf, which is used, and it's said that the shochet will touch the edge to make sure that it's very sharp. That it can't have any rough edges. And this is, of course, to make sure that the cut is quick and easy, and the animal loses consciousness as quickly as possible. The final part, which is very important, and excuse me for the picture, but this is an important image. Exsanguination, difficult word to pronounce, is the bleeding of the carcass, letting the blood flow. This is where things get difficult, whether the cow or the animal's hung upside down, or whether there's other ethical ways of doing this. And this is, of course, we're told the core value, we can't eat the blood. So the proper shechita will make sure that the blood is drained. So you briefly, when the animal's neck is cut, you can't interrupt it, you can't press it, it's a quick slice. You have to get rid of the hair, so there's nothing in the way. It has to be at the right place, and you can't tear the vessels. Just essentially a quick and easy slice, and then afterwards they check to make sure everything's okay. And if it's kosher, it's especially kosher. It's glot kosher, which means even the lungs are checked for abrasions or cuts. And there's might have seen heard the term glot kosher, extra kosher. So just very briefly, there's the past. And then there's the reality, and this is what I'll get into a little later. Kosher slaughter is not what it used to be. And so there's stunning, which Sarah pointed out, which this is where things get controversial because the animal needs to be fully conscious for shechita. And briefly, is kosher slaughter ethical? So it can be. However, modern agriculture, where 99% of meat, even kosher meat, comes from factory farms where the animals are treated very cruelly, and it's only the moment of death that matters for both halal and kashrut. All of these issues come together to say, if all we care about is that final moment, what about the environmental, social justice, human rights issues of the rest of their life? So from my perspective, it's not just about stunning.
Okay, so we're going to move over to kind of why is ritual slaughter contested. And I also just want to say that I know that we're rushing through everything quite quickly so we can keep within time and answer questions. But if you have questions about specifically about stunning and these things, be happy to answer them when we have the Q&A. But for now, I just want to share 2 images to kind of maybe situate why this is contested. And so here we have one painting referring to the blood libel, which is not about ritual slaughter, but it is about kind of Jewish, dietary laws and the idea in the kind of 14th century and around then, where there were accusations that Jews were using the blood of Christians to create their matzah. And so an idea of really kind of focusing on Jews and their dietary choices, which would often lead to pogroms when these kinds of allegations would emerge. And then several centuries later, in 1993, when Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, he forbade kosher slaughter of meat in Germany. And so we have these kind of historical examples of kind of focusing on Jewish dietary practices and religious requirements around food that have made Jews scapegoats, and the specific targeting of dietary practices to justify anti-Semitism and hatred against the community. And this is also kind of ongoing. So currently, and I'll stop my screen share so we can see everyone. But the context in which the bans in Europe have emerged have also really kind of aligned with a lot of far-right political parties and their politics, where kind of in the past 10 years, the focus, I have to say, is probably much more focused on the Islamic community and Islamophobia in a context of anti-immigration policies in Europe, and therefore kind of focusing on halal meat. And so, kosher meat is probably also getting subsumed in a bigger debate that is more focused on Islamophobia than it is on anti-Semitism, but the two certainly coexist. And so you have far-right parties, in addition to the laws that have been adopted in the countries that I mentioned, Denmark, Slovenia, Finland, Belgium. You also have far-right parties in Germany, in the UK, in France, in Austria, that have all proposed bans on ritual slaughter, including halal and kosher slaughter. In 2018, a far-right party in Austria kind of went so far as to propose a law that would require Jewish and Muslim people to register if they were to purchase kosher or halal meat. And it's not exclusive to Europe. And so we know that similar questions, debates do occur in Canada and especially in Quebec. And there were reforms to Quebec's regulations around slaughter that were centered around animal welfare, but also responding kind of very explicitly to concerns around instances during the year when around Ramadan, people would go to farms and purchase sheep that they would slaughter kind of in conformity with the rules of Islam, so they could have that meat to sacrifice an animal for Ramadan, and that raised a lot of concern about animal welfare and allegations of barbaric practices and all of the kinds of things that we hear in that rhetoric. That also led to politicians suggesting that maybe some of these people would be subject to criminal charges for animal cruelty, and also led to a kind of strengthening of rules around who could slaughter animals, where and when, and reforms to the licensing requirements for abattoirs. And so on the one hand, we have a very real concern about animal welfare and the ways in which they are killed, and kind of the dignity and the suffering in those last few minutes before they're killed. And on the other hand, it's impossible to deny the way in which kind of attempts to restrict kosher and halal slaughter tend to kind of map on to periods when there are strong anti-immigration platforms and narratives that emerge around immigrants don't treat animals well, we good citizens do, and therefore we have to protect animals by kind of restricting these traditional practices. And so that certainly becomes a narrative in which a lot of these discussions and debates occur. And so that is something it's very important to be kind of aware of these challenges, but at the same time, not ignore the very real animal welfare concerns that motivate some animal rights advocates to push for reform. And it also results in some occasionally unholy alliances between the left and the right, between animal welfare advocates and far-right parties who see opportunities to collaborate, but might not kind of share all of those, share all the same philosophies. So it's something that is kind of very important to be attentive to. Rabbi Dolin, do you want to say something about this before we turn to the debate in Canada today?
Sure. Well, just very briefly, I mean, connected with what you were saying, the challenge is, when laws are passed about animal agriculture, but there are not similar laws protecting other animals, or we start to question what the reasons for doing this are. You have if you're if the hypocrisy of having so many laws that protect companion animals, cats and dogs, and not as many laws that protect farm animals. Yet then suddenly these laws are being passed that really are focused not on animal agriculture as a whole, but on kosher slaughter or halal slaughter. Again, I start to question: is this really a desire for caring for the animals and a fight for animal ethics, or is this anti-Semitism, Islamophobia? And you don't always see the same organizations working together, to fight for more animal ethics and animal agriculture but as Sarah said, there's these tough relationships where you have liberals and right wings parties who are or organizations who are trying to get rid of something, not necessarily because it's for the animals, but because of the religious group that is promoting this form of slaughter. I think I got a little confused there as I was trying to explain that, but it is something that is very sensitive. And again, as someone who deeply cares about animals, it also is fearful of anti-Semitism and that growing threat. The borders really get a bit complicated. That's it, Sarah. Go back. You can go ahead.
Great. So what we wanted to do with the kind of the remaining time that we have is just maybe kind of think about, well, so it's not to say that this debate has never come to Canada, because it kind of has already occurred, especially in Quebec. But if we were to see either Quebec modify its legislation, or at the federal level, if the Canadian Food Inspection Agency were to change the Safe Food for Canadians Act and its regulations, and this became a constitutional challenge in Canada, what would that look like? And we don't have time to get into a whole constitutional discussion about what this would look like in Canada. My sense is that if the same arguments were raised in Canada, our kind of protections for religious freedom are quite strong in Canada, and I would expect the Supreme Court would hold that a kind of complete restriction on ritual slaughter would not be held to be constitutional. But one of the things that that Rabbi Dolin and I kind of think is important is that the debate has been quite narrow, and so it's really kind of pitched as this animal welfare, pre-stunning, or religious freedom, and we can't really talk about anything else. And so Rabbi Dolin has some things to kind of add about the environmental aspects of this, and kind of how animal agriculture fits within kind of a broader conception of Jewish environmental ethics. What I'll say is that I don't know how many of you have heard on the news in the past week. Even I know my uncle sent me a link to this, and so I know that it's not just the people like me who are interested in this. But a few weeks ago, there was undercover video footage that was leaked about, or kind of posted, shared with Wired magazine, about at a pig processing plant in California owned by Smithfield Foods, which is the largest pork producer in the world. And it it shows in really graphic ways what is a standard practice in the conventional pig processing industry, and also I should say not limited to pigs. But the method that's used for stunning pigs today is predominantly asphyxiation by carbon dioxide. And so the animals are kind of loaded into a chamber, which is lower, or kind of lowered, pushed into a crate, lowered into a chamber filled with CO2, and the animals asphyxiate, and it takes probably around 1 minute for them to become unconscious before they're then subsequently unloaded and killed. And this then kind of raises these questions about, pre-stunning might be essential to reduce suffering, but not all stunning is created equally. And the conventional practices in animal agriculture are kind of increasingly becoming understood to be quite cruel as well. And so you have a number of veterinarians who have written an open letter to contest this method of slaughter, and who are suggesting that it's kind of inconsistent with the rules around eliminating avoidable suffering. And Temple Grandin, who there's a slide before, who's kind of a world-renowned expert in humane handling of animals before slaughter. She has also said that the ways in which CO2 chambers are being used right now are inhumane, without ruling out the possibility that that other breeds of pigs and other conditions might be able to experience this without suffering. And so the thing that I want to raise, and that I think that if anyone invited me to say anything to the Supreme Court, if this became an issue, would be this idea that it's possible that we're kind of we're balancing the wrong things. And this debate in Europe maybe provides an opportunity to think about, why we have standing requirements and what they should be doing in service of animal welfare. But that kind of we're focusing on the wrong thing when we have billions of animals that are killed for meat each year who are also experiencing extreme suffering, and that might be a more important conversation to be having. So maybe I'll stop there and let Rabbi Dolin conclude.
Yeah, so I definitely share those thoughts. I mean, again, this final moment of an animal's life, this is what the laws, this is what the conversation is about. Judaism also reminds us, we have this idea of Tza'ar ba'alei chayim. We minimize the suffering for animals. Bal tashchit, we don't waste resources. Obviously, human rights, every other social justice cause that we can connect with this issue, those need to be on the table also. And the challenge is within the Jewish community. I would say there are times when I'm speaking to especially more traditional members of my community, don't mess with this. Don't touch the way we eat. Don't touch something which has this, which has been done for centuries. My community, sometimes even a conversation about Israel is an easier conversation than discussing the food that we eat on a daily basis. So the point is, when this discussion is had, if it ever comes to Canada from a legal perspective, the issues of social justice need to be moved to the forefront. You can't have a conversation. I would argue you can't have a conversation as a member of the Jewish community without bringing up all these other issues, human rights, environmental issues, and everything else. We know, the climate crisis is such an important part of how we need to be interacting with our world now, and animal agriculture is directly related to that. And I would argue the violence that is in some ways inherent in this act, that we aren't focused enough on what that really means from a moral and ethical perspective, also leads to other challenges such as violence in our society, wars and suffering in other contexts too. So there's definitely a lot to discuss, and I think that every value that we hold, that I hold as Jews, we hold as members of the human society, need to be brought into this conversation. So it's not just about that final moment of death. And that's how we need to continue to have the conversation.
Once again, sincerely, Professor Richardson, Rabbi Dolin, thank you very much for your presentation, your rich presentation, and your time. And we would also like to invite everyone to our next event that will be in 2 weeks, same day, same time. It will be titled, "We Were Not Taught to Think for Ourselves, Haredi Youth Negotiating with Religious Authorities in the Age of Digital Connectivity," by the PhD candidate Malki Porras. So I will salute and thank you very much once again.